Good morning, everyone, afternoon, where I'm at. My name is Hazel, and I use she, her pronouns. And I come to you from stolen and unceded Piscataway Indigenous Territory in Washington, D.C. I come to you as a highly melanated descendant of enslaved Africans and freedom fighters, a worker for justice and equity. And I come to you as a relentless follower of Jesus Christ. Folks, there is much to lament today. There is much to pray for today. And there is much motivation to practice justice today. And this world can leave me spiritually breathless. And for me, it's been helpful to just find stillness and pause and to take some longer breaths. So I just want to invite you where you're at to pause and take 3 long, intentional breaths, just to land and prepare ourselves for what God is saying to us today. Pray with me. The day is ahead of us. We come to this time filled with the remembering of things to be done and things that may have to be left undone. Some of these things are changeable, and for others, they are finished. Yet you, O Lord, have created us to live our lives thankfully unfinished, joyfully ever changeable, and in faith ever growing. We praise you for your presence in our lives, for your love for us in this moment, for the courage you have given us, that we might, in our hearing and in our sharing, take that courage and step out into the world as workers for your peace and your justice. Quiet our hearts, precious Creator, in this time, that we may hear more clearly where you are calling us. Standing in the glorious light of your divine being, we give thanks. Amen. I want to first say that I'm really glad to be here. And I mean that in a lot of ways. I'm glad to be here, alive, present, breathing this breath. And I'm glad to be here in a church service. I'm glad to be here amongst you all. I'm glad to be here with my friend, mentor, and colleague, Reverend Jane, who has been a spiritual teacher and mentor for many years. So thank you for having me, and I look forward to some time of Q&A to learn a little bit more about you that I can't find on the website. So let us dive into our time together. So we're living in this Kairos moment. Kairos meaning that this is the time, and not in this like it's 3 o'clock time, but in this moment that Jesus talks about in the Gospels when he says, be ready, for no one knows when the Son of Humanity will appear. And the world in our country is reckoning with the sins of racism, ableism, homophobia, environmental degradation, Christian imperialism, patriarchy. We could talk forever about the sins of our nation. And we're reckoning in a powerful way. And I think for me, the question for this moment is, are you ready? Are you ready not to just sort of be kind and nice or stop doing 1 or 2 things, but are you ready to lay it all down, to go all in? The passage in Matthew 16 really keeps coming to me. I know we'll talk about the gospel today in Matthew 18, but Matthew 16 keeps coming to me where Jesus asks people, are you going to lose your life for my sake? And then this moment, Jesus is asking us, especially speaking to those of us with privilege and power in this space. Jesus is asking, are you willing to let go of what you held as true and what you thought you knew? Are you ready to lose your lives? Are we ready to lose our lives for the sake of the liberating gospel? So I really want that question to be in our hearts and minds as we move forward. I just want to share a little bit of the description of the image you see on your screen. It is the image of a sunset over the water. And in the middle of the page, you'll see a chain breaking. Thank you to Sheila for noting this in the chat. The image of the chain breaking and turning into birds flying free, and that is the intention. How do we understand forgiveness as a breaking of chains of ourselves and of the people that we feel like we need forgiveness from? Breaking of chains so that we can get and stay free. And something that's really, and birds really remind me of freedom. That's why they're there. I'll say too, in my time in the Episcopal Church, it's been, when I've preached, there's not always these really beautiful moments where all of the texts and passages align with pointing towards the same goal. I often have to be like, okay, how does that speak to that one? But today, we're really lucky that all of our sacred texts today are really pointing us towards the same goal, which is freedom found in the practice of forgiveness. We see in Genesis, says, I beg you, forgive the crime of your brothers and the wrong they did in harming you. Now, therefore, please forgive the crime of the servants of the God of your father. In the epistle from Ryan, we hear the naming of the hard truth of where this church might need to grow in our relationship between and amongst the two services and communities. In our gospel, of course, I forgave you all that debt because you pleaded with me. Should you not have had mercy on your fellow slave as I had mercy on you? Now, I want to share, before I get into the themes, I wanted to preach on the issue I had with the fact that there's anything that is called a slave, the fact that someone owns someone else or owes a debt to someone else. We could preach about that forever, but the Spirit told me to do something else. But I just wanted to share that I dream of a world where no one's anyone's slave or is in debt to anyone. And I want that to be also a part of our backdrop today. So Jesus once said, the truth will set you free. But as his disciples have learned over these 2,000 plus years, truth doesn't come cheap, and there's usually a price to be paid. And that price usually means we sort of have to become willing to live the lessons that the truth might teach us. And today we're looking at the truth of God's forgiveness. And it's a truth that if we really get it, if we really get into it, this truth will likely shake up our world and change the way we live every bit as much as our letting go of the things that keep us from experiencing the fullness of God and the fullness of humanity. Now, in my experience, anytime the gospel writer Matthew has kind of a tough spiritual truth for us, he sort of trots out the good old parable. So we've got the parable today. And so Peter asks, Lord, when a person offends me, how many times do I have to forgive them? How does 7 sound to you, Jesus? And in the Old Testament teaching in Amos, if we go back to the Amos, God says, you should forgive people 3 times, maybe even 4. And so here, Peter in our gospel today is sort of more than doubling that number, kind of feeling good about himself, like, oh, I gave you 7. You said 3, I'm going to say 7. But Jesus shocks Peter and maybe even shocks us when he says, don't just forgive 7 times, Peter, but 70 times 7. Or in some readings, it's 77 times. Now, if you're a biblical literist, you'll look at Jesus' answer and say okay, 77 or 490 if you do that math. But for me, Jesus has neither 77 nor 490 in mind when he responds to Peter. Rather, he is poetically making the point that Peter has to think bigger, expand his understanding of forgiveness. And so I want to start by looking at some of the dynamics of forgiveness that I've seen in our society. So there's this idea, right? When someone wrongs us, an injustice has been committed, and because of that wrong, we kind of feel like, all right, this person has to pay. I'm owed something at this point. And we are kind of conditioned to believe that if we simply just forgive, then the wrongdoer kind of gets away with it and we don't feel good about that. So we don't want to just simply dismiss it. And so we might respond in various ways. And one way I've seen is to find a way to make the person pay for what they've done. Sometimes it's done passively. We might break that relationship or kind of ignore them out of existence. And sometimes we actively seek ways to make people pay for their transgressions. We say or do things that harm them. We speak ill to them or about them to others, hoping that others might turn on them. And we feel that if the person who's wronged us begins to suffer in some way, we have been kind of compensated. And one of the problems, just one of the many problems with this, is our attitude, what it does to us. So once this sort of action begins, it becomes all-consuming. And eventually it can turn into some cold-hearted hate. And we see this kind of dislike for just one individual, or like seeking the punishment for one individual being mapped onto groups of people. We see this in the prison industrial complex. We believe in punishment, assuming that this is the way to restore right relationship. And God is telling me that this is not the case. And we see this in our current society, what's going on in our world, where not only, again, do we begin to paint the individual as some sort of problem or someone like them, right? But we begin to map it onto people like them. And so I might have a terrible encounter with an older person, and so I'm like, oh my God, all old people are this. And I begin to treat them with that framework in mind. And what happens, as we see, especially for folks who are negatively racialized or multiply marginalized for whatever reasons, that we begin to create this concept that Ibram Kendi has sort of named in his book, stamped from the beginning. We begin to stamp and label people long before we even know anything about them. And then we begin to claim that these are the kinds of people who deserve the worst kind of punishment for the minimal transgression, and in some cases, for no transgression at all. And so we see that what is in this passage, in this parable, is actually not even what God in the very moment has even asked. When Jesus says something, this is like what my grandmother told me, when Jesus says it, Jesus means it. And so there's an explicit answer. I need you to forgive more times than you imagined. That's the response. And this, for me, is not the end all, because it still poses a problem. Like if we read that passage all the way through, we see that the king himself, the king in the parable, does not follow through on this command. Even if the command was to do just the 77, it was like a one and done. So instead of forgiving the servant again for the transgression, the king tortures and imprisons that person after what we assume is a second transgression. So for me, it's not just about the servant who was forgiven and was tasked with trying to extend that forgiveness to their servant, but I also think about the king, the one who is the figurehead in this parable, who did not follow through on his own teaching and certainly did not follow through on Jesus' teaching. Matthew 5 says, "You hypocrite, first take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from someone else's." James 1 says, "Be doers of the word, not just hearers." And Romans 2 says, "You then that teach others, will you not teach yourself? While you preach against stealing, do you steal?" Sort of like this practice what you preach thing. And so these passages really point us to something that I know and I'm grateful to have heard that this congregation is committed to. You have all been doing this work around deconstructing racism. And we got a chance to read and listen to the beautiful epistle from Ryan this morning. You know, I see in that story this pivot where Ryan says, I need to unpack my own backpack of white privilege for myself, my husband, my children, my white family, and our church. We have work to do. I have work to do. We are in this moment where we are participating in and witnessing the convergence of all of the ills, racism and homophobia and environmental degradation. We see it literally manifest. I mean, you all in California, God bless. I'm originally from California too, so I feel like very deeply connected. And there's, again, so much to lament. We see this manifesting in our bodies, in our communities, in our earth. And we can see, even for ourselves, that it's becoming harder, for me at least, to see like, oh, it's becoming harder to like just focus on what's going on out there. feel like we're being convicted to say like, okay, what's going on in here? How do these ideologies live in me, live in us? And so we must dive in and unpack that proverbial backpack, if you will. Really asking ourselves, where in this system have I been participating and complicit in perpetuating racism? We need to begin to look at ourselves and ask, where have I refused forgiveness toward others? Where do I still need to be forgiven? Where, like the king, have I demanded from others the very thing that I am unwilling to do? Am I ready to let go of the definitions, the frameworks, and the practices that have benefited me for so long? Am I ready to let them go in order to get free and help others get free? Am I willing to tell the truth of where I have been the king in the parable, unwilling to forgive even when God has made it clear to me that this is the task? And, you know, as Christians, we really want to be the best character in the story. I think about the story of the Good Samaritan, where everyone's like, I'm the Good Samaritan. And maybe that's true. There are times in all of our lives that we could be the Good Samaritan, but I am like, okay, I've got to be honest. I've walked past some people a couple times, you know, just tell the truth. My grandma, again, she says a lot of good things. We grew up Baptist, so we got some good phrases. And she said, you know, tell the truth, shame the devil. That is the work, right? So how do we look at this passage and say, okay, I might resonate with the king in the beginning, like, oh, I'm so forgiving, and I, you know, let this person, gave some grace to this person. We're like scene one king, but we don't want to pay attention to the places where we've been scene two king, right? Where he says, okay, you know what? You're going to go, I'm going to torture you and imprison you because you didn't do what I wanted you to do, right? We just have to be true, to be honest with ourselves about the places in our lives where we've been king scene one and king scene two, and just tell the truth, because those are the places from which we can actually build. If we don't tell the truth about our ills, we'll continue to perpetuate them. And something that that kind of comes up to me, and this is not at all to be contentious, but again, I just let the Spirit do its thing. And I said, okay, we'll see. But the first thing that I thought of is like, we have this really interesting, I'll just say interesting in this particular context, interesting way of seeking punishment and retribution. If we think about like the arc of forgiveness is either we like forgive, and in other ways, as I've been saying, is we seek revenge, we seek punishment. So, thou shalt not murder. Yet, in many states in this country, the punishment for murder is murder, justified. And this is not at all to be contentious. I'm not even trying to talk politically about it. It's not why I'm here. It is just to let us see. It's to awaken us to the ways that our own ideas of forgiveness and punishment kind of bind us and imprison us in this vicious cycle of violence and oppression. And we have been socialized into a punitive justice mentality. For me, I think about experiences growing up when folks were in school and maybe caused a harm or weren't paying attention in class. The punishment was expulsion, detention, suspension. At home, if you got in trouble, it's time out and you have to be away from everyone. Really, the move was to remove you from community in some way because you caused a harm. And if you grow that mentality up, this is where you can see sort of, again, the prison industrial complex, where we cancel people and we throw people away. And that process is something that we live in and swim in, this cancel culture and this throwaway culture. Yet, we are called as Christians to be people of forgiveness and to be people of right relationship. How do we reconcile this dynamic? The first question I always get, well, am I supposed to just let people walk all over me? Absolutely not. You did not hear that from Hazel Monae. That is not the call. At the beginning of this conversation, I mentioned that there are many ways to respond to harm. And one of those practices is sort of moving toward punishment and revenge. And another way is to respond with forgiveness. And it doesn't mean like this kumbaya, sweep everything under the rug kind of forgiveness. And it doesn't also mean that the person who caused the harm doesn't have to be held accountable. What it says, though, is that we have to find new ways of what it means to be held accountable. If our only way of accountability is punishment and revenge, I don't know what kind of Christianity that is, and that's not something that I want to participate in. But if we shift our understanding of forgiveness to an idea of refusing to get sucked into the vicious cycle of getting even, of bitterness, of hatred, if we claim to be children of God, then we must take seriously the call for liberation, the call to unpack our backpacks, to unburden ourselves, to commit to community, creating the conditions in which it is possible for transformation and renewal. When we think about our own social context, particularly around racism in this country, white bitterness and suspicion and hostility have been passed down through the generations. The lack of forgiveness for whatever thing that they think folks of color have, crimes we have committed, has been passed down through generations. Yet, Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and other people of color have rarely, if ever, on a grand scale, have rarely sought revenge. And this is not to glorify the immense pain and suffering BIPOC folks endure, but it is to glorify God's call, not of revenge, not of punishment, but of forgiveness, of justice, and freedom, which is the call currently in this nation. And I don't want to talk about forgiveness as like this like super easy thing. It is hard. I mean, I am a Black queer woman living in this country. Sometimes I just want to like, I mean, I'm not a violent person, but sometimes I just want to like, ooh, you know, I'm not going to say it because I'm a Christian. I'm trying to keep it together. But you know what I'm saying. It's hard out there. And forgiveness is extremely hard work. And for me, sometimes the desire to inflict misery on the person who's hurting me can really be stronger than my desire to forgive. That is the reality for me sometimes. But I actually end up not only suffering the wrong done to me by another person, I begin to suffer in my own way through loss of joy and trust, creativity, and love. For me, I think of this question: could we imagine living in a world that is trying to kill you every day and still not seeking any kind of revenge, solely asking for justice and equity, only for the people who have harmed you time and time again to continue to punish you and to be unforgiving and unrelenting in unforgiveness? Like, just have compassion. That's an invitation to compassion. Feel it. Our communities, and I'm talking about BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color, Latinx communities, have been practicing forgiveness so that we can get free. And that all of us, not just we, but all of us could get and stay free. And that's what forgiveness is about. It's not this like kumbaya. And it's about the 70 times 7, which is not about sweeping it under the rug and just letting things slide. And it's also not about punishment. It is about creating a culture of freedom. And I cannot be free so long as I'm holding you bound to my desire for revenge. Where's the justice in that? There is none. I want to, two sort of notes. Jesus is often talked about in a very mystical Son of God, Savior way. And there's some resonance for me. But for me, the heart of the Jesus story is that Jesus walked and lived a human life. And in his very human life, he was constantly challenging oppression by the ways he interacted with others and by the ways he spoke about the principles of our lives. And we have some semblance of that in the Episcopal tradition. I've been listening a lot to the presiding bishop, Michael Curry, who's been kind of working with this framework, the way of love, just following the way of Jesus. And in it, he gives the 4 pivots: telling the truth, proclaiming the dream, repairing the breach, and practicing the way of life. And what I love about these is that these are gerunds, the ing, which means it's constant. It is a practice. It is ongoing. And the more we practice, we will become free. We'll break patterns of isolation, accumulation, individualism, supremacy, revenge, all of the things that we thought we needed and we thought we knew. And this stuff is heavy, and I know. And oftentimes when folks talk about oppression, we kind of get uncomfortable. It can be difficult to talk about the small ways that we all participate and contribute to these issues. And we might want to begin to name like, oh no, I have a Black friend and I'm LGBTQ cool. Like we begin to sort of defend ourselves. And this is not at all accusatory. It is, however, a challenge. I'm here before you, imperfect, yet still willing. And that is my hope for all of us, that we would focus on what God is calling us to do, that we would reimagine 77 or 490, reimagine everything that you thought you knew about forgiveness. Reimagine it as freedom. And when we practice that forgiveness as freedom model, I do believe that as Ryan has invited us in the epistle, the work that we have to do will become lighter. So let us get and stay free. Amen.